Hello, pattern readers. It's been a minute since I've had a video for you. The month of January was really nuts for me, so I kind of took a little break. February is probably not going to be much better, but here I am. And in this video, I wanted to talk about some fandom reactions to The Wheel of Time Season 1. And I also, in future videos, probably have a couple of other Season 1 topics I'll want to cover. And I'm planning a video to update my predictions and outline for how Season 2 could adapt books 2 and 3 and possibly more. So those are some things to look forward to. After that, I would like to get back to my reread videos for a little while. If you follow my channel mainly for the TV show content, you might not be familiar with these, but I started this channel with book content for The Wheel of Time in breaking down the Wheel of Time books chapter by chapter in a reread format. So they're a nice companion to doing your own reread, or can even be a substitute for a reread. If you don't have time to fully reread the book, you can binge the series of videos, and it will not only remind you what happened in the book, but also talk about the big character moments, the themes, all the little bits of foreshadowing and details that you might only pick up on a reread. These videos don't get as much views as my other content does, but there are people who really enjoy them, myself included. And I have done The Eye of the World, The Great Hunt, and New Spring, so next up will be The Dragon Reborn. So if you spend time in the Wheel of Time fandom online in any space, you're probably going to notice there are a wide diversity of opinions on the show, especially among book fans. So I wanted to kind of talk about like the sort of categories of groups within the fandom that I see, just to help kind of clarify who I'm talking about when I bring up some different points, because some of the things I'm saying are specifically directed to certain groups within the fandom. So my guess would be one of the bigger groups out there are people who came to the show without having read the books beforehand and enjoyed it. I know I don't know that for a fact, but logic would tell us that that's probably one of the bigger groups out there who are fans of the show. Now, I'm obviously excluding people who didn't read the books, tried watching the show, and didn't like it, because those people, I'm sure they exist, but they also probably just stopped watching it and moved on with their life and didn't bother continuing to talk about it very much, unless they were like paid to write a review of it or something. So what I'm focusing on for this group are the non-reader show fans. A second group that I think is probably pretty large and diverse are fans of the books who enjoyed the show and have a range of criticisms from mild to major. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and say that there's probably no one out there who was like a huge fan of the books and the show and had zero criticisms. I just think that would be like a vanishingly small number of people, so I'm not really considering that a group. But this group that I'm talking about are the reader show fans. Number 3 would be what I think is probably a smaller but nevertheless extremely vocal group of people who hate the show and talk about it a lot. Now, a lot of people who fall into this group would say that they've read the books. So either they've read the books, or maybe there are some people out there who are just claiming to. I think there could certainly be some people in this group who talk about it mainly because it fits with a political argument they want to have, rather than something specific about the books that they've read and were disappointed. Now, for this group, I am specifically talking about people who complain about the show because it's too woke, people who are starting petitions to get the show canceled or replace the showrunner, people who are making personal attacks against people involved with the show, or people who are out there saying they like the show. So I just want to be clear who I'm putting in this group that I am calling haters. And then the fourth group I think is also smaller, can be hard to say here, because this is a group of people who have read the books and were seemingly expecting an adaptation to be much closer to what happened in the books, and ended up disliking it because it was too different from their expectations and the way things happened in the books. Now, it can be difficult to distinguish here because sometimes the people in the hater group are going on and on about how the show, ruined Robert Jordan's legacy and how much it's changing the books and so on. So I'm trying to make a distinction here. People in this fourth group are not the ones complaining about how woke the show is and so on. They're just really expected the adaptation to be closer to the books and don't like it. So I'm calling these people book only fans. So again, if you've spent any time in any of the Wheel of Time online fandom spaces, you will definitely have encountered some of those haters. They show up everywhere in comment threads, no matter what the original content was talking about. They certainly have been engaged in review bombing. They seem to have an awful lot to say on something that they proclaim to have been not worth watching past episode 1. I could honestly do an entire video where I just go through some of the insane comments that I've gotten from people in this category and poke holes in some of the ridiculous things they say, but it's not even worth it because honestly, they want to be mad. I don't really have anything useful to say to them. I'm sure they're not really interested in anything I have to say, although they do watch some of my videos in order to comment on them, which again, why are you watching videos about the 8th episode in a TV show that you apparently hated so much that you couldn't watch past episode 1? But okay. But just to be clear, these are people who are accusing me of things like being paid to say I like the show. Because of course, if you don't like something, it must be objectively bad. No one could actually like it. And so if they're saying they like it, they must be being paid to say that. I've been accused of lying. I've been accused of buying these books in the background solely for props and never having read them. Never mind that you could glance at my channel for like 2 seconds to see that I was doing videos on the Wheel of Time for fully more than 2 years before the show came out, and that the first videos that I did were completely about the books. But, don't bother. That's okay. But honestly, that's enough about the haters specifically. I more so wanted to talk about people who are in these other 2 major categories, people who enjoy the show, have read the books and enjoyed the show, and have some degree of criticism for it. Because again, I think everybody has at least some criticisms, whether they're small, nitpicky things or really big concerns. That is a pretty huge and diverse group of fans. I'm going to, again, assume that there are some people out there who legitimately are book fans and were truly disappointed that the show was not more like the books. So these 2 groups have had a very different reaction to something. And I wanted to kind of delve into that more. Like, why are people having such diverse reactions to something? Why are there people out there who are like, well, you can't be a book fan if you like this show. You can't be both. And why are there other people who are out there being like, but these are 2 distinct things, and I can judge each one separately on their own merits? Obviously, if you watch my channel, I'm in the category of people who love both the show and the books. And yes, there are things that if it were up to me, I probably would have done a little bit differently about the show here and there, which is not to say that I'm arrogant enough to think that I could completely redo the whole thing and make it better. There are some fans out there who seem to have that opinion, and that's pretty wild. But I think it's perfectly fair to point out, hey, this part didn't make sense, or this part could have been a little better if it had been done this way. So those kinds of things are totally fair, and it's good to have those kinds of conversations about helpful criticisms. So that's the group I'm in. I am interested in talking a little bit to people who either have much more severe criticisms of the show than I do, or people who just genuinely don't like it and think that it is a bad adaptation because of how much it departed from the books. An important reason why I wanted to do this video, it's something that's just been kind of bouncing around in my head for a while now that I wanted to try and articulate, is that it was inevitable that there would be these 2 different groups, that there would be some people who would love this adaptation and some people who would not, even if we're just talking about book fans, because we're a pretty diverse group of people. There are a lot of fans of these books, and what we love about them is not all the same. And of course, the show is not going to be able to focus on every single thing that the book's focused on, and some people are going to like what the show chooses to focus on, and some people are not going to. That is just inevitable. So this was bound to happen, but I will say, for people who fall into that category of wanting to like it and were disappointed because they didn't, I understand that. I understand being disappointed because you thought this would be for you. You wanted it to be for you, and it turns out it wasn't. So it's totally fair to feel sad and disappointed and even maybe a little upset and mad about that. Like, I get that. That's understandable. So then the question is, do you give up? Do you just say, all right, this is not for me, I'm done with it, I'm moving on, I'm not going to keep trying? Or do you want to keep giving something a chance? And if you do, is there a way that you can adjust how you think about something to actually potentially end up liking it? Because I did notice that with fan reactions to the finale, especially, there were a lot of fans out there commenting. And their initial reactions were like, oh, all negative, and all the things that were different that they weren't expecting and they didn't like. And then a lot of fans who like sat with it and rewatched it and came back later and were like, oh, I like this a lot better than I thought. So that becomes the question for some people. Again, I don't think there's anything wrong with just stopping and saying, yeah, you know what, this isn't for me, I'm not going to watch it anymore. I think that's fine. That's totally fair. Like, I'm not trying to convince everyone to like this show. I know some people won't. That, again, that's part of what I'm trying to say here, is that it's inevitable that not everybody will like something. So for me, I think a couple of big differences between whether you might fall in one of this category or the other comes down to your expectations and your perceptions. So that is where I think we can kind of examine those a little bit more. Maybe if you're someone who's like, I don't know if I like this, or I don't think I like this, but maybe I want to give it more of a chance, looking at those things, maybe that'll help you. So I think having realistic expectations going into something is pretty key. Now, some people might already be able to get there because maybe they were expecting the show to be a lot closer going into season one. Now that they've seen season one, they have a better idea of what to expect. Maybe for some people, that's enough, just having that different expectation. I think I had tried to really prepare myself to have the right kinds of expectations going into the show. And a lot of the content I was doing on the show was kind of designed to try to help people come along with me on that path, because I felt pretty sure of where we were headed here. It helped me even honestly to know some things. Like, I knew, for instance, that Perrin would have a wife in season one and that she would die in the first episode. And I think knowing that going in kind of helped me prepare myself a bit in a way that might have been hard for people who had no clue that that was coming. And I can imagine having a very different reaction to that if I'd had no idea that was coming. But if you're someone who is right now asking yourself, but why did they do that? Why did they make changes like that? Why are they adding so many things when there's other things that aren't going to make it in? There's probably a lot of people asking themselves those questions. I tried to address that in a really broad way. Again, prior to season one, I did a lot of videos on adaptations in general. What are the reasons why things change in adaptations? And I looked at other examples. So, some big ones that I looked at were the Lord of the Rings movies and Game of Thrones early seasons, because these are adaptations that people often think of as very successful and very close to their source material. And examining, like, what were those adaptations really like? What kind of changes were really made? Because I think sometimes the perception doesn't always match the reality. So if the perception is that those adaptations were very close to their source material, I would say, broadly speaking, that's true. But the changes were still really significant, and people probably forget that when those movies or that show first came out, that there were probably a lot of fans reacting very similarly to some Wheel of Time fans are reacting now. Like, why were these things changes? Some people are still upset that Tom Bombadil is not in the Lord of the Rings movies. And again, there's quite a lot removed from the Fellowship of the Ring to make the Fellowship of the Ring movie. And you have in Game of Thrones characters who are made up and added for the show. So there are significant changes in those adaptations, but we just kind of have a different perception of them than the reality. So again, I've done a ton of videos trying to answer that question. It's not something that's easy to answer in a really short and pithy way, but I wanted to try and use a little math to explain it in a different way for you. So I looked up some comparable fantasy adaptations, whether movies or TV. And I looked at the number of words that were being adapted compared to the number of hours of screen time they had to adapt those words, so we can make some comparisons. So let's actually start with the Harry Potter movies, because you would actually expect that movie adaptations of books would have less time to work with. It's a tighter time frame to adapt a book. Now, some of the Harry Potter books are shorter, but it works out that if you consider all 7 Harry Potter books and all 8 of the movies, they were adapting about 55,220 words per screen hour. Then let's go to the Lord of the Rings movies. In this case, I am considering the extended editions. We get a little bit better. We have 42,325 words per screen hour. And then let's go to Game of Thrones. And here we would expect a little bit better because it is a TV show. Now, I'm just focusing on seasons 1 through 5 here because those were the seasons that had direct source material to adapt. So for just those 5 seasons, they were working with about 35,400 words per hour. Definitely the best ratio of the bunch so far. Now let's talk about Wheel of Time. Now we don't know how it's going to work out yet, but we do know the total number of words in the Wheel of Time book series. It's 4.4 million. By far the biggest number of any of the comparable texts that I was looking at here. And then we have an estimate, let's say, for the number of screen hours that we might get. Rafe Judkins, the showrunner, has said that he outlined how he could do an adaptation of the entire series in 8 seasons. If they stuck with the number of episodes per season that we had in season 1, which is 8 roughly 1-hour episodes, that would work out to be, if we are very lucky, 64 hours of screen time to cover those 4.4 million words. And the math works out to 68,750 words per screen hour. This should be most comparable to Game of Thrones, considering that both are roughly 1-hour streaming series rather than theatrical movie releases. And yet, the number of words per screen hour would work out to be nearly double that which Game of Thrones had to do. So if we really think about that, think about, okay, Game of Thrones was able to stay relatively close to their source material in those first 5 seasons because they had a little bit more breathing room to do so. Of course, they still changed some things. There were still some significant differences between these two properties. But if we try to compare to what Wheel of Time is trying to do, to adapt nearly double the amount of material in a comparable amount of time, it's daunting. It's huge. It's never been done before. And so you really can't expect that the adaptation would go in a roughly similar fashion. Or if you do expect that, it kind of makes sense why you'd be a little disappointed. And even with that in mind, they still roughly followed the overall story outline of the first book in the first season. Now, they won't be able to continue doing that, of course. Again, no one is even aiming for 14 seasons. It is going to be different going forward. The plot lines from season to season are not going to match up nicely with the books going forward. They're going to have to look more specifically at story beats, maybe plot threads that they can follow, change, remove, etc. There's a lot of implications to any change they make. And we can't see all of them, right? So if we see some of these changes that they're making in season 1 and we're scratching our heads and going, why did they do that? It doesn't make any sense. Why didn't they just do it this way? Part of that might be is we don't know their outline. We don't know their outline for 8 seasons. We don't know how they are managing to prioritize and condense and tell a coherent story in so much less time. That's what I'm hoping, that some of the things that even I am looking at in season 1 and going, well, I'm not really sure why they did that, that it will perhaps make more sense going forward when we see where it's leading. And if it turns out that some of these things don't lead anywhere, then I guess there were some missteps, but we don't know that yet. So when I see people complaining about something being a plot hole, there's lots of complaints about that. Something is a plot hole. I'm like, well, you can't really know that yet because we don't know where this is going. You don't know what is going to be explained or how it's going to be explained. Something could turn out to be a plot hole, but it really remains to be seen. So another thing that a lot of book fans seem to be really unhappy about is the fact that the show was not nearly as focused on Rand as the first book was. And this is a situation where, again, I would think that if people's expectations were adjusted a little bit, maybe this could make a little bit more sense, right? If you look at the series as a whole, none of the other books besides book 1 were nearly as focused on Rand. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have one season of the show be as focused on Rand when the rest of the seasons are not going to be. You even have books that have almost no focus on Rand, like book 3. And I don't think you can go that far in that extreme either. I don't think the next season of the show, if it's covering book 3, can get away with having Rand drop out of the story for half of it. So it needs to be a balance. And I think that they're doing the right thing by trying to balance as much as possible the major characters throughout the season. That's hard to do, and it's not going to be perfect. And I think for me, the character that maybe lost focus towards the end to the biggest detriment was Perrin. So hopefully that's something that will be balanced out a little bit better as much as possible going forward. But I think it was the right thing to do to shift that focus a little bit and to have other characters be just as prominent in the first season as Rand was. And Moiraine, of course, is especially center stage because you have an actress like Rosamund Pike, which I've talked about before. Now, you can go a little too far in that direction. I happen to think episode 6 would have benefited from having at least a couple scenes that were not totally from Moraine's perspective. So, for instance, the scene where she takes the dagger from Matt, I think that scene could have been better if it had been framed instead from Matt and Rand's perspective rather than Moraine's. So, there needs to be that balance. I think overall they're trying for that. It's not perfect, but it makes a lot more sense than just trying to match the focus that the books had. There's another factor here. As I talked about, I think a lot of this comes down to both expectations and perception. So some of our perception might be a little bit skewed, and we might think that Rand got a lot less focus in season 1 than he actually did. And this is where numbers can be our friend again. So in this case, I was not doing any number crunching, but I did want to share some number crunching that someone I follow on Twitter was doing because it was some really excellent work. So let's go to that. So this is from Camille, who is on Twitter as the Rational Nerd, and you should definitely give them a follow. Now, this chart is just one that was done for season 1. And if we look at it, we can see that Rand comes right after Moiraine in total screen time for the season. But if we factor in the amount of screen time that Moiraine was unconscious or dead in someone's dream or asleep and so on, Rand actually comes out ahead. And so those book fans who are thinking that Rand really got way less attention than he should have gotten compared to Moiraine, well, your perceptions are off a little bit. Now, you can still have opinions that differ about how that screen time was used and so on, so I'm not taking that away, but it's just a matter of checking our perceptions a little bit. Going back to that chart again, we can see that, it's pretty well balanced between these major characters, and not surprisingly, Matt comes in last because he wasn't in those final 2 episodes, Nynaeve after that because she was basically absent for an episode, and then Perrin is the lowest after that. So that kind of fits in with my perception that he got maybe a little less focus than he should have gotten. But overall, they did a fairly good job balancing this just in terms of raw screen time, but perhaps some of the specific choices on how to use that screen time could have been tweaked a little bit to make things a little bit better. But if your perception was that it was really imbalanced, I think that perception is off. Now, Camille really broke this analysis down much further and got into things like who were people sharing screen time with? How much of that screen time was them like in a group where they weren't really saying much versus in a scene with just one other character? Because that's really relevant too and super interesting. So I'm not going to go through all of that with you here, but I will link it for you because I highly recommend you check that out. If you're at all a numbers nerd or you're just curious about how the screen time broke down for season 1, really interesting and useful stuff. So I think the last thing I want to just touch upon here is, again, I'm trying not to address most of this video to the haters because I think there is no point in that, but I think there are some overlaps in these groups and perhaps some of the things that they bring up are shared by people perhaps in that 4th group. So talking to the book only fans here a little bit again, for anyone who is out there thinking, some of the choices that were made in the show they disagree with because they think something was changed for a political agenda, they're really talking about things like representation, right? So, for instance, having the relationship between Moiraine and Swan be more prominent, be more developed, be more on screen. Some people maybe didn't like that choice. I loved it. But if you're someone who didn't or who's questioning why these decisions are made, there are people out there saying like, oh, all of this is just done for representation. And I wanted to link you to something on this topic because Jenny from the Lesbi Nerdy channel addressed this issue in a way that was so eloquent and perfectly stated. I'm not even going to attempt to add my own words to what she had to say here because nothing could be stronger or more powerful than what she had to say. So if you have any questions, any uncertainty about this idea of representation on screen, why it's done, what value it is, I could not recommend more that you watch this video, because she speaks so eloquently from the heart, from personal experience, and I was really moved by what she had to say. So I will link that video for you and strongly recommend that you check it out. So I think I will wrap up my discussion of this schism in the fandom here. As I have been trying to point out, I think this is inevitable. I think it is okay that this adaptation is not for everyone. I think if you are someone who is disappointed but maybe still wants to give it a try, you are the people I am trying to talk to most, because I hope that by changing expectations, changing perceptions a little bit, maybe that will work for you if that's something that you want. The book fans who absolutely were steeped in these books and ended up loving the show as much as the book. So it is possible. I count myself in that group. I talked to many of other people who were in that group, and the key thing for me is just they are separate things. They are not the same, and they don't need to be, and I'm not trying to make them be as close as possible. I'm really trying to separate and appreciate each on their own merits. It's a hard thing to do, but that is what I'm trying to do. Any of you out there who are struggling and, trying to get on board with that, I hope anything that I had to say here was helpful to you. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you will like, share, and subscribe, especially come back for more. And until next time, you came in peace, depart now in peace.